as you well know, in which we're waiting. And we can either wait for something to happen. You don't know what's going to happen. I might sit here and say something very different than what you expect. And you might be very disappointed, and then you would have waited for nothing. And doesn't that happen often when we wait? So then we take up the challenge of bringing mindfulness to what's happening in the moment. And in this way, life provides us many, many and ample opportunities for the cultivation of mindfulness. When we have the telephone receiver in our hand and we're waiting for someone to answer the telephone on the other line, we take a moment to acknowledge the sitting. When we're in a traffic jam, wonderful opportunity for sitting, for seeing, for acknowledging the irritation and the frustration and the impatience. In the post office, where I live down in the Mission, where I've lived the last year in the Mission in San Francisco, there's one post office serving a large community. And I have wonderful opportunities standing in line to come to standing, feeling the ground underneath my feet. So you can't ever say to any of us that you don't have time to meditate, because I know it's not true. Yet again, I have to admit, I don't know what it is about you all, that I have one idea about what I'm going to talk about, and then I just feel caught in trying to investigate a whole different idea. And so tonight really is not a Dharma talk that's very well thought out or ever been given before. And it's really more an investigation, and I feel in many ways that we're all in the same boat together. And what triggered it off for me was talking about Sangha earlier on this afternoon. And that just stayed with me. Thinking about Sangha and the importance of Sangha, especially as we're all leaving. And what Sangha means in the context of our daily life. And I was thinking of it also in relationship to the topic I was going to talk about, which I will a little bit, which was around relationship and sexuality. So we'll see how it goes, and and maybe also I want to leave some time for questions and answers at the end too. When I was thinking about both topics, relationship, sexuality, and Sangha, what...
You're not the only one who's been thinking about that, I'm sure, in this room.
What I came to was, again, something that all three of us have really been saying a lot, over and over again, about mindfulness and the cultivation of mindfulness. Because so deeply ingrained in us is the idea and the wrong understanding that insight and wisdom and truth and the cultivation of mindfulness to come to these is primarily and mostly found in a meditation hall, doing sitting and walking and sitting and walking. And you know, in my experience, I just have to say, it's not true. And very luckily for us, because we don't spend most of our time in meditation halls. And it would be a sorry state of affairs if it was just in the meditation hall that we came to mindfulness. Then, if we see the cultivation of mindfulness being as important outside the meditation hall as it is inside the meditation hall, what we go back to becomes very exciting and very challenging. And it is when we see it in that way that Sangha suddenly takes on a whole new life of its own, because Sangha then becomes the container, can become the form that holds that continued exploration of mindfulness. Not only that, but that because of where we are in the development and the rooting of this tradition in this culture, we're really at the cutting edge of it. We're in a position, an enormously creative position, of manifesting a tradition in a new way. When we talk about cultivating mindfulness in our daily life and the creation of Sangha, we are right now creating something very new. We become the holders of something that will take root for hundreds of years after us in this culture. That is very, very exciting. It's very exciting to see what once we thought of as primarily an individual pursuit of coming to liberate ourselves, as actually a social pursuit as well. In its ultimate vision, surely is also and primarily our liberation for most of us. For some, the liberation of all beings. But it becomes quite different to see it in that context. Daily practice then isn't secondary anymore. To put it another way, here in this context is created the form of sitting and walking in order to cultivate bare attention and general comprehension, along with the Dharma talks and the interviews with the teachers. Outside of this situation, we use our relationship not to our breath and body only as the primary ground for this, but our interrelationship with the rest of life. So our primary object isn't just the breath anymore and our body, but it's the breath and our body in relationship to our lover, in relationship to our work, in relationship to our environment, in relationship to the rest of life. So that the primary object becomes in relationship to, which is there all the time anyway. And what I'm saying is that that is our primary object. Having this practice too, because I think you need this practice too. I think you need both actually. Can be the ground for enormous development of wisdom and compassion, of freedom. It's no less important. In fact, just as we say the body and mind in a way are inseparable, you can't have a mind without a body, and you can't have a body without a mind, alive anyway. So ultimately, you can't do this practice not in relationship to. They're the same, they're together. We are part of an environment. We are in relationship to. And we can't cut out, as we can't cut out our body and just be in our minds, we can't cut out in relationship to the rest of the world, the rest of our relationships. This is what Sila is all about. When the Buddha talked about the practice, about the path of liberation being based on 3 foundations, Sila, or morality, was one of them, right? In the Eightfold Path, he talks about Panya, wisdom, right understanding and right thought. He talks about Sila, right action, right livelihood, right speech. And then he talks about mental training, effort, concentration, and mindfulness, the 3 pillars of this practice. Sila is about the form that we use, the container for the cultivation of mindfulness in relationship to whatever it is that's happening at the moment, our car, the paper that we have in front of us, our work, the telephone, whatever. What's very exciting about that is that we are really creating that container for ourselves. And to see that. Because we don't have a tradition of it here, as in the Asian countries. Not only that, but because of the conditions in this country, it wouldn't be appropriate to directly transmit the particular way Sila is expressed in those countries. So Sangha becomes the expression of Sila. The container in which we continue the cultivation and the investigation that brings us to freedom and liberation. It's revolutionary. It really is. Because that's what we're doing. We're in a process of transformation. And that transformation isn't just happening to each of us single individual units. We really are part of a movement. We really are part of a mass movement. I just don't think it's been so clarified. It was in the student movement days, and it was with the feminist movement. But for the Dharma movement that we're in, I don't think it's been so clearly expressed what we really are in the middle of doing. You know, so when we come to meet in our study groups, the investigation, I dare to say, shouldn't just be purely looking at the Buddha's texts, but should be the exploration of just what I'm talking about. To acknowledge the social implications of what we're doing is to acknowledge Sangha. In this context, then, How do we make sense of the precepts? In this context then, what are our guidelines? Primarily has to be always the acknowledgement of what's happening, and that's where we start. That place of coming into connection with ourselves again. And then also there has to be the acknowledgement of the context that we're operating in. When we're talking about creation of Sangha, what we're doing is talking about how to understand, how to talk about, how to act, how to be in our lives in a way that continues to build this movement that we're in towards our freedom. It's again acknowledging that we're not alone and that we can't do it alone. If we could do it alone, we wouldn't be here. We can't do it alone. To really come in a deep way to acknowledge our vulnerability. And it's that very vulnerability that becomes the basis of understanding the precepts. Because we're very vulnerable and we can't do it alone. And because we're very vulnerable and we can't do it alone, we come to make agreements with each other. We come to support each other. We come to create structures that help each other. And it's all based on our vulnerability. The fact that really we're very open and very connected, and so any one of you can hurt me. Because you can. And I could hurt any one of you. And that we can hurt life. Because we're very vulnerable to each other. Really. And because of this very open and deep vulnerability we all have to each other, and that all life has, in recognition of that, we then come to look at how can we live that first precept of non-harming, not harming life. And what does that mean? If I really allow myself to become very vulnerable and to really open, for example, to the environment, I can take it all the way down to cutting down the use of toilet paper I use, because I know what it means to hurt a tree. It can be as small as, do I pick flowers because they're pretty and then throw them away when I'm on a walk somewhere? It can be choosing not to wear some leather goods because I know I'm hurting life in the process. If I really live with my vulnerability, I become very sensitive to the rest of life. And when I'm very sensitive to the rest of life, then I want to move in a way that doesn't harm it. All my actions then will start to move towards that direction of non-harming. Sometimes it's theoretical, and that's okay. When a mosquito buzzes around my head, I really have the intention to kill it, sometimes quite often. And I have to talk to myself about it. So I'm working on an intellectual level. and saying to myself, Arina, this is life. It's small life, and you might consider it unimportant life, but it's life. And do I want to hurt it? Do I want to hurt life? And I don't. And so I don't kill the mosquito. That's okay too. It's okay to talk ourselves into it, even if we don't feel it. If I'm building something, perhaps I don't want to use teak wood because those forests are being devastated. And so are all the species living in those forests. There are all sorts of ways that once I become vulnerable and I bring my mindfulness, I bring my presence of mind to the relationship, I can start to see how to live in a non-harming way. And when I'm in relationship and I'm non-harming, I'm not harming myself either. In this context about thinking, I want to say something about right thought. That sort of hit me in this country a little bit, because I wasn't born here, so maybe it was a little easier to see. And also because I've just finished my schooling here, and I was sort of surprised in a way about the experience. You know, you have in your constitution, I think it says it's self-evident. It is self-evident that. And that's sort of interesting to me, and I thought about it, and I thought about the Puritans that first came to this country that had as their basic assumption in their religion the a priori assumption that there was a God. We assume it to be self-evident that there is a God. And that's translated into your constitution. It is self-evident. What's the connection? What is Arina driving at? Does she know? You also have, it is self-evident that all men are equal. And I think there's this basic cultural assumption in this country that if it isn't self-evident, it's not worth investigating. And it's not worth thinking about. And it can't be true, because if it was true, it would be self-evident. And that cultural assumption, alongside the particular way we practice, which is to, for very good reason, not to use thinking as our primary object here, often tends to mean that we don't really use thinking as a way to investigate the truth. And I really want to support us in the context of being in Sangha, of creating Sangha, of living with the precepts, of creating this cultural transformation, this cultural revolution for us, to use the thinking process. I think that's what right thought is all about. Bringing thinking to this process and really investigating it. Really investigating what it means to live in a non-harming way. In this context, I can talk about sexuality. Here is a subject that has enormous, enormous weight in our lives. that really isn't brought under the light of investigation too much, and certainly not culturally and socially, and yet it determines so much of our behavior. Not only does it determine so much of our behavior, but really there's a lot of harming happening in the name of sexuality. It's this part of the talk that I feel I'm not sure I know any more than you do, so. When we look at harming and non-harming in our life, we can look at the more, obvious ways that sexuality creates harm. 1 in 3 women in this country will be sexually abused. 1 in 5 young girls is sexually abused by her family or intimate friends, and 1 in 8 boys. I heard that a woman was raped every 4 minutes in this world. I think it's probably more. There's an enormous amount of harming done in the name of sexuality on this kind of gross level. And we all know that it happens on a more subtle level. That each one of us here in this room has in some way or another participated in a sexual relationship in which we haven't felt good about, in which we wouldn't use the word healing or healthy. And it's very understandable, because this culture puts enormous weight on sexuality. It has become the cradle for the only place in our life where there's intimacy and where there's touching. It has become the modern spirituality, in a way. Whereas in other cultures at least, and probably in our cultures long time ago, we made connections and came into connection in deep ways with life in many more areas. So now in this day and age, often it is just in the sexual arena that we can be intimate and come into connection with. It puts an enormous burden on sexuality, on the sexual act, to carry this weight for the whole of our lives, to come into connection. Not only that, not only is it expressed in this culture as the main way to come to happiness and to come into connection, you know, through songs of love, through movies where finding someone you love and being sexually attracted to them and having a sexual relationship becomes the answer, the be-all and the end-all of your life. But at the same time, most of it is hidden. How many of us really talk to our friends about our intimate sexual relationships? It's certainly not really discussed that much in the open. We don't. It's very, very hidden. And because it's hidden, it becomes the vehicle for the expression of all that is hidden to us in our lives as well. So that those parts of ourselves that we don't own, our shadow parts, very easily become expressed in the vehicle of sexuality. Because it's also so hidden, at the same time that it's so important. and seen as the main way to express our deepest desires for connection. What a contradiction to live with. Not only is it seen in a way as the cultural spirituality of these last few decades, especially as traditional religions have been on the wane, but that part has also become distorted in the consumer culture, so that it's not that we just only want to come into connection with ourselves. That's the positive part of it. The negative part of it is that we use it as a consumer item. How often have we picked someone up? That's the English expression. What's the American expression? Pick someone up? How? Pick someone up, flirted with someone, not because we cared about them, not even because we wanted to be in connection with anything, but we wanted the high. And it's cheaper than drugs. A lot. Sexuality also becomes the major way we escape from ourselves. It becomes the most sought after consumer item. How to run away from myself. And again, in this context, it's very easy because we so objectify the sexes and use certain physical characteristics as an excuse for the sexual act. Get it? Do you? We look at someone and we find them physically attractive, all of which is conditioned by our past and by movies and TV. Finding someone physically attractive doesn't have anything to do with whether this person really is compatible with you, is in any way right for you. So you see these physical characteristics almost divorced from the rest of the body sometimes, let alone from the personality. And that becomes the excuse for a pickup. It even becomes the excuse more for a relationship. How many relationships have you been in, or do you know others in, that have started because of physical characteristics, where the sex act is good and you end up in a relationship with someone you hate or you don't like, or that you end up having these terrible fights and struggles with for years? It's really amazing when you think about it. How it's used and how we hurt each other around it. And I'll say one more point about it, because I think it's something that also isn't that clear. And that is the way power intersects with sexuality, especially in this culture. Because the fact is that in many sexual relationships there's also a power imbalance. It's usually gender related, but not always. You know, it could be that a woman boss has a relationship with someone that she's employing, or a teacher with a student, a therapist with a client, or just a man who's not really aware of the power that this society confers on him and uses it unconsciously. And how the needs of one person then in the relationship very subtly determine how that relationship is expressed, because one person has more power than the other. You know, and in this culture, it's not been that long ago where women really and their pleasures weren't considered. It wasn't considered important. The man and the man's pleasure was considered to be more important than the woman's, and women were there to serve men's needs sexually. And women didn't even talk about it. They were ashamed of it 100 years ago. That's not so long ago. It was only in the 60s that Betty Friedan and the women's movement really started to explore that in many relationships, when there isn't a clear balance of power, it becomes very painful when it's sexually expressed, because sexuality is such an intimate part of our lives. One person gives up their power to another, and one person takes that power. So given that, and this little exploration, where do we go with it? I think, first of all, to start to become very aware of how we're behaving sexually and the nature of our desire in relationship to it. You know the story of there was a story in the newspaper about a year ago of someone who had AIDS, it was an anonymous story, who was writing about how he didn't tell his partners, the people he picked up in the baths, that he had AIDS. And I remember reading that and being really shocked. And then thinking, are you that different, Arena? At that scale, yes, but how do you relate to your desire around sexuality? And do you let it run you? Really looking and investigating, how am I relating to sexuality and my desires around it? And then I think really coming to understand that sexuality is not what this culture puts it out to be. It is not the path to come to wholeness. It is not the vehicle to come to wholeness. Not by itself at any rate. That spiritual practices, in the context of a spiritual practice, in the context of what Jack talked about last night, about dukkha, about how unsatisfactory things are, about how things change all the time, about anicca, and that we really can't hold on to things, and about anatta, the selfless nature of things. When we bring the spiritual truths into our sexual relationships, then our sexual relationships can become another vehicle, a way to express those truths, and that's quite different. But then sexuality is being in relationship with, it's coming down and becoming part and in connection with all of us and all of our lives in a way that's very healing. When I have a partner who supports me in coming to understand that I can't expect permanence, because life is impermanent, and that things may change, and that I don't have control over that. When I have a partner that supports me in understanding that it's imperfect, and how to live with the imperfection of each other in the expression of sexuality, then it's very different. When I have a partner that helps support me not to identify with, not to own, in the relationship, in the experiences of the relationship, in the sexual act, it becomes very different. Then it really becomes Sangha. Sangha becomes the support and the exploration and the living of those three truths. Sometimes in sexuality, sometimes in eating, in working. It becomes, I can't do it myself, Will you help me? Can we make some agreements about it? It becomes, you know, I really like you, and I'd like to sleep with you tonight. Let's talk about that. You know, it becomes, how do we really own and take responsibility for what we want and communicate it clearly so that we empower the other person to say, yeah, that's great, I'd really like to do that too. No strings attached. I would just like that exploration. Or no, I really don't want to sleep with anyone who I can't be in a relationship with. Because we have non-harming there in our hearts. We start to care about the people that we're in relationship with. It can just be a very small thing of touching in and saying, how are you feeling right now? What's happening? What's going on? And then, when there's a reply, not owning it, not taking it personally, but allowing the other person to have their own experience. That's a small thing. But imagine our relationships in which we were able to have that kind of communication and expression, where we really allowed each person to have their feelings and we didn't own them, we didn't take it personally, and we didn't identify. Imagine having agreements around that so that when we got caught, we had some agreements on how to process that. And imagine not having that with just our lover or our friend, but with our friends. Imagine having it even with some of our working partners. Hey, you know, if I do something that you think's off the wall, I really want you to come and tell me. That's really important to me because, you know, I really do care about you, or I really respect you and I want to support your work. And saying that not just once to our working partners, but over and over again over time. Can you see the web, the holding, the creation of Sangha in that movement of beings living in a new way together? It's really beautiful and it's really revolutionary. Well, I thought well, I want to stop there, not because I really wanted to leave some time for questions and I had no idea how quickly time was going. So, so maybe I can just round it off again, because I was going to talk about all the precepts and so I talked about non-harming. Let me just end up by saying that a night or two ago, I can't remember when it was, Jack and Rodney and I were in the staff room talking, and we were talking about something, and I said, you know, I had a dream of talking to thousands of people, just like Martin Luther King. I have a dream. I have a dream. And this is my dream. That the inspiration we have found here together is just the starting point of a new way of living. That the vision that we have, that the connection that we've come to, manifests in the continued exploration, in the continued cultivation of freedom for us and all beings. I have a dream that we here in this room can manifest Sangha in a way that makes our lives outside this hall as important in the development of mindfulness and in the development of realizing ourselves as the work we've done in this hall. In this way, may our lives be blessed. Thank you.
I have a question about non-harming that in fact very kind and reflects on how we implement the Sangha. It's something that I'd like some help around just personally in my own relationship to it, and also to open up to how we think about it as a Sangha. And that's the level of cockroaches and flies that exist here at IMS. For me, it's not a laughing matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are several levels of non-harming, and those levels are somewhat paradoxical. I mean, I think at the level of you killing mosquitoes, you have a choice around that you made in the way you did, and that seems totally in harmony. I think to make the kinds of decisions that we make around the cockroaches and the flies here puts us in contradiction to the Board of Health, for one thing. And I think the consciousness as a whole, I do not think the Tassajara Red Book that Jack read from yesterday could have been written in the IMS kitchen during a 3-month retreat. I worked in that kitchen, and I would go and put something away in the pantry, and there would be 30 flies there to greet me. And I found that for me personally, the only way I could deal with it was not very skillfully by just walking. I just found myself becoming aware.
Yeah.
And I've raised the issue. I've left a couple of notes, and I was left a note back that the cockroaches are being dealt with in some way that sterilizes and changes their hormones or stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not a cockroach expert, but I was here in October, and the cockroaches look every bit as healthy. There's no generation gap. There's toddlers. You'll see some grandfather cockroaches. And I think we need to do this. I think we really need to look at it as a Sangha. And I'm really serious about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I I think that's a really important question, and it reminds me of what the monk said in the 3-month course who came to visit us. I'm horrible name, so I forget what his name is. And someone talked to him about the same question, and he said, a lot of it depends, as Jack also mentioned in his Karma talk, on your intention. Do you have as your intention the harming of? Is there that feeling of wanting to hurt? And I think that's an important part in looking at the issue of harming and non-harming, is our intention around it. Because there are many situations in which we do kill. For example, the beautiful the beautiful, I mean, that you all know already, I'm sure, from stories of Native American Indians and how they kill, where there's prayer around the killing, where there's enormous gratitude around the killing of animals for the food that they eat. And that because that's the intention, and that's the relationship to, it feels very healing, and it feels very organic and in relationship to. So I think that's an important part of what you're saying too, that sometimes, yeah, we do need to kill. It isn't that we should never not kill. And what's at issue here is our relationship to it, our intention and our energy behind it. And in this case, I think that many people would agree, I mean, not to go into the specifics of IMS, but to see it generally, that in many situations, yeah, we need to kill. And it's for healing. And that's our intention. And it's for creating environments that are conducive for healing. And that's what you're saying. At certain points, we need to make the decision to kill in order to have environments that are conducive for health and healing. And that's what being part of an imperfect world is all about. And that we're also killing all the time, in a way, in eating. Eating is about killing. And life is about killing, in that sense. And it can engender enormous gratitude and gratefulness that we've been given the gift of life. In this context, we might almost, in eradicating the flies and the cockroaches, also feel enormous gratitude for the space that's left, for the clean space that's been created, and for the life we've taken in order that we come to the space that is free of them. That's the same as having enormous gratitude for the life that's given to us, that we ingest inside of us, that we might live and do this work.
Around this issue, and especially around intention and death, I have found myself in a situation a couple of times, more than a couple of times, where I felt on a very deep level that I needed to intervene to end a life, both to end the suffering of the animal and to end my suffering in watching the animal suffer. Somehow there has to be a middle way through this issue of killing. When I assumed the responsibility of the life of the animals that I care for, I also assumed some kind of responsibility and caring about their death. And it's not a wonderful position to be in. But it's also somehow part of my life that causes me anguish, and it causes me more anguish not to act at that time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That what you're saying is that you're coming from a place of love, and that's what's important. And careful consideration, because that's an important part of it too. That there needs to be an investigation and a careful consideration of our actions, but that when the intention is coming from a place of wanting to heal, that's quite different and necessary and important. That's right. Yeah.
You say
Okay.
something?
Kathy?
I've been waiting to do this talk for months.
You have.
And I'm really, really deeply grateful to you. I think that the potential for Buddhism in the West is to really understand non-karma in every sense, in everything that we do. And not to follow the examples of Asia and how people view non-karma, but come up with our own definitions and our own wisdom and our own practice. And living at the center, I think we who are on staff come up with questions a lot about Sila and find it difficult to find the context in which to talk about it. So I just wanted to thank you. And I think we need a lot more, this needs to be the stuff of a lot more talks and a lot more discussions in retreat and out of retreat.
Thanks, Kathy. One more. Andre?
I wanted to ask if you could say a little bit more about the problem of dealing with sexual desire and getting carried away with it as a source of suffering. Of all the desires, it's perhaps the most compelling one to us that wanted to be for. Can you say something more about that?
Yeah. I would like to see groups, Sangha groups, people in this practice meeting to give each other support around working with sexual desire, because I think it's something that is a long process. I don't think there's a simple answer for it. I think it's that the way that we work with sexual desire, as I said, is laden with a lot of our deepest yearnings and aversions, both at the same time. And I don't think it's just a simple 1-2 matter, but really a way of coming to a deep exploration of ourselves by looking at that place in us. And for some of us it's alcohol, some of us it's food, and some of us it's sexuality. It's different. But to take those parts of our lives and to use it as the food for our Dharma, as a way to come to explore, to see the truth of what's happening inside of us. The 12-step programs are doing that beautifully, but they're not 100% in alignment with some of the teachings and some of the truths that we come to hear. A lot. And if you're living in a situation in which there isn't a Dharma support group or people in this practice that you can come to and work with, or just people in your community that you can work with in an ongoing way, and if then another place to do it is in a 12-step program. But my vision really is that we take up this exploration actively in the context of doing this work, in the context of the truths of Buddhism, and not see it as a fix-it, just in the way that we don't see our meditation as a fix-it. Looking at our relationship to sexuality is not, I want to fix it and then everything's going to be fine. It's about our process of relationship and how to continually refine it and make it more true and make it more healing. And that's pretty long term, but also very exciting because it's liberating. We come to free ourselves of that grasping and that holding and that acting out in compulsive ways that's so full of suffering. So that's what I suggest. Okay, it's 8:05.
Thank you for listening. To learn how you can support the teachers and Dharma Seed, please visit dharmaseed.org/donate. donate.